One Piece is never going to end even after the final chapter, and that's a good thing. Even after 2 decades and 1100 chapters, no other manga that's come after One Piece has lasted nearly as long. Obviously, Shueisha is pushing the manga so they can make money, but they wouldn't be making so much money if people didn't still like the story so much. But it does make you wonder what it is people like so much about One Piece that they can keep reading the same manga for 1200 chapters, and now probably another 300. That's why in this video, I'm gonna discuss where One Piece succeeds and so many other popular manga fail, and explain why even after the final chapter, they are never going to stop making One Piece. And the best place to start is by talking about what's gonna happen after the final chapter, because a lot of people like to claim that when One Piece finally ends, that's the end of it and Shonen Jump is just gonna burn to the ground. But the reality is that even after the final chapter of this manga, there's going to be a lot more One Piece. Anyone who reads more than a few manga can tell you that. They did it to Dragon Ball, they did it to Naruto, they did it with Fairy Tail, Araki is still doing it with JoJo, and after enough time, even Kubo did it with Bleach. So if you think that the manga that is selling as much as Batman and Superman is just gonna stop when the story ends, you are sorely mistaken. But even in a world where Shueisha decides enough is enough and they don't make any One Piece sequels or spin-offs, Oda will never not want to make more One Piece. In fact, he's the whole reason this manga has lasted as long as it has. The real secret behind One Piece's success is Oda's insane creative drive. Ever since the very first chapter, he has had a drive to tell this story with as much detail as he possibly can. As a result, Oda is constantly adding more and more to the story, even when he's not actually telling the story. Mind you, Oda never intends to drag out the story the way he does. There's been plenty of rumors about when Oda originally planned to end the story or how long he wanted it to be. And he's always saying the manga is gonna end in 5 years, only to keep saying that for 10 years. But the reason he keeps continuing the story, even when he really does want it to end, is because he has this superhuman drive to write down every idea that pops in his head. And this is what separates Oda from so many other writers, his ability to keep writing the manga even after he runs out of his original ideas. Part of why you don't see long-running manga anymore is because it's almost impossible to continuously come up with new ideas after 5 years, especially when you're writing and drawing everything by yourself. Recently, we saw this in Jujutsu Kaisen. Akutami had a great idea in the beginning, and clearly had a bunch of ideas he wanted to explore later on. But when the time came to wrap things up, it became clear that Akutami was running out of ideas and just wanted to end the story. Stuff like the Heian flashback just never happened, and fights like Urame vs Hikari, which were literally already set up, just had the whole middle part cut out and we only saw the very end. And that end sucked. Mind you, Oda is guilty of off-screen fights too, but that's for a different reason. He does it because he's got too much stuff going on, not because he doesn't know what to write. And that's exactly why he can continue to write One Piece for as long as he has. While many other writers have a great idea in the beginning, but don't build on it, Oda is constantly throwing in details that don't even have to do with the present story that he can use to set up new stories down the line. And most of the time, he doesn't even do it on purpose. Usually he's just doing it because he's that creative and he doesn't want to hold back any of the details that he's got in his head. He does it when he randomly hints at characters in the lore. He did it in Skypiea when he came up with this whole economy for the different dials. And more famously, he does it in the cover stories where he tells these stupid little stories that somehow influence the plot hundreds of chapters later. One of the best examples of this is Enel's cover story. Basically, after he loses to Luffy, Enel takes his fancy ship and just casually flies off to the moon. Granted, it was kind of relevant because Enel had said his plan was to go to the moon. But once he gets there, he starts fighting space pirates and recruiting moon bots. And Oda even tells us their backstory of how they got to the moon. And suddenly, Enel is exploring the center of the moon and uncovering this lost moon city. And at the time, it was like, what does any of this have have to do with the One Piece or the world government. And mind you, stuff like this is kind of why One Piece fan analysis is so bonkers. To this day, I get a migraine every time someone draws a red circle on a panel of One Piece. But guess what? Enel's stupid moon adventure ended up foreshadowing stuff that didn't turn up in the story for like hundreds of chapters. And this is the weird game Oda plays where he can just randomly add stuff in just because he's so creatively driven, and hundreds of chapters later, he can use that random story to build on the main story. Now it's at a point where even when the story feels like it could have ended a long time ago, Oda can keep writing new arcs because there's so much content and so many characters outside of the main plot that he can explore. And that's why Oda can keep writing new arcs like Egghead or Elbaf and keep extending the lifeline of this manga. But I already know what you're thinking. Obviously, the manga can't go on forever. At some point, 5 years really will be 5 years, and Oda is gonna have to end the story. So what's gonna happen then? I mentioned before that they're gonna keep making One Piece, but what does the future of this series really look like? Is it gonna be like God of War, where they hand it off to someone else and basically tell a completely different story? Are they just gonna tell a bunch of spin-offs? Basically, what's gonna happen when Oda finally decides to stop writing One Piece? Well, first of all, I don't think Oda will ever stop writing One Piece. I mean, at some point he's gonna have to stop, whether he gets too old or his family locks him out of his office. But until then, Oda is always going to have that superhuman drive to tell this story. This drive that has motivated him to create weird snail phones or tell random side adventures about Ace milking cows is the same drive that's going to drive him nuts as soon as he steps away from the manga. So he'll probably take like a year off when the manga finally does end before he goes right back to making more One Piece. And the reason I can say that with confidence is because Oda is still making One Piece. You look at other long-running series like Family Guy, and at a certain point, creators like Seth MacFarlane want to be creative in new ways. But then you have a guy like Oda, who's been writing the same story for almost 20 years, and doesn't plan on stopping for another 5 years. Because of his unparalleled drive to make One Piece, we can all count on him making more of it even after the story ends. We can't say for sure if that will come in the form of an actual sequel, or if it will manifest in a bunch of side stories, but Oda's not gonna stop being Oda anytime soon. But like I said before, Oda's gonna have to stop at some point. So then it's like, okay, when Oda is finally done for good, then what's gonna happen to One Piece? I mean, if Oda is the secret behind the success of One Piece, then wouldn't it be doomed without him? You see it happen all the time to other series. They change writers, the story completely changes, and the fans just get up and walk away. So why wouldn't the same thing happen to One Piece? It could, but you have to keep in mind that the same system Oda has created to continue writing One Piece is the same system that anyone can pick up and continue after the story ends. And I specify after the story ends because we're talking about a different situation than something like Berserk. In that case, Miura passed away, and now they're finishing a story that is technically still incomplete with whatever notes or information they have. But we're talking about a future where One Piece ends, Oda hands it off, and now new writers have the freedom to basically write their own story. The reason they'll be able to do that is the same reason Oda can keep writing new arcs. At this point, there is such an ocean of lore and characters that it's less what would they write about and more where do they want to start. Oda has created so much good content that really any decent writer could pick up the story and do the minimal amount of writing to make it work. They could do another Ace spinoff, they could go the Medulo route and write One Piece in space, they could write a One Piece prequel, which there's plenty of details for that one. There is so much stuff that they can use to write future stories that look and feel like One Piece, but even after the manga ends, they can really keep this series going for as long as they want. Not to mention remakes of the anime, live adaptations of the anime, video games, and if they want to, more movies. But the last point I want to address is less about Shueisha and Oda and more about the fans. Because even if Oda doesn't stop writing One Piece, you would think fans would eventually get sick of the manga and just stop reading it, especially when the story is officially over. But the reason fans of One Piece will never stop reading One Piece is because it stood the test of time. One Piece has entered that group of stories that have lasted long enough where now they're a constant comfort that everyone can fall back on. It's the reason World of Warcraft still gets players while new MMOs barely survive their first year. The reason Pokemon still sells new games and trading cards even after plenty of games have forced it to change. And it's why they can keep making Batman comics long enough for a new writer to change the formula and basically tell a brand new story for old and new fans. You reach a certain point where if a story does well enough for a long enough time, it passes that BS test. It still has to keep trying, but at that point, fans know they like the story and they don't need it to be the best thing all the time. One Piece is at a point where fans can confidently take a break if they want and check out other series because they know they can go back to One Piece whenever they want. They know that One Piece is gonna have its ups and downs, but it will always come back up. And that's the real reason One Piece will never die. Part of it is because the writer is a super freak that pumps out ideas on a constant basis. Part of it is because he's made so many ideas that the manga has kind of outlived its own story. But another part of it that supports One Piece more than we might remember is that One Piece wouldn't be so popular if people didn't like it so much. And because fans have enjoyed it for nearly 2 decades, it's reached a point where they can always come back to it even when they or whoever is writing it decides to take a break. And that is why One Piece is never going to end.